Hello, everyone. Thank you guys for coming to the second meeting of the Audacious Book Club. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Torrey Peters, author of Detransition Baby.
Hey
Hi, Torrey.
everyone. Hi, I'm so thrilled to be here.
We are thrilled to have you. How are things going?
Things are pretty good. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to have two chances at it. I think that I think when something like this happens, it actually bonds people. So and I feel like I've been with you all for 5 days now. So I'm excited to talk.
Absolutely. I'm excited too. And thank you, everyone who was able to make it tonight. We had to do an emergency reschedule on Thursday because of the strangest problem, but it has been resolved and all is now well. And we're going to have a great discussion. And in fact, many of you have already sent in some really great questions. So if you have other questions, please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. So, Torrey, I love this book. I thought it was provocative, and I mean that in the best possible way, because there were several points throughout the book where I read, oh my God, I don't know if I should be reading this because that seems like a secret. And it felt very intimate and very revealing, but it also felt like cis people weren't the audience. Like we just got to read it, but it's not for us, specifically in the way that people tend to believe everything is about them. And so, what made you think about the perspective that you wanted to use in writing this book?
Well, I had started out self-publishing actually in here in Brooklyn. I was self-publishing these little novellas um, for a group of other trans women, where mostly, they were sort of passed hand to hand, and I knew that the audience was trans women, and I wanted to write. I mean, those those novellas really did have sort of taboo subjects, or like sort of airing of dirty laundry, because I was like, I wanted to be able to have protagonists that weren't doing a sort of respectability or representation. Like if I could have just like messy protagonists, I could just sort of tell these stories without representing. And so my original audience was mostly trans women. But the thing about trans women is that we're like not a uniform group of people, So like, it's impossible to write for all trans women because they're, and my trans experience is a very specific experience. And so what ended up happening is I started writing this book in the exact same way. I was planning to self-publish it as a little novella, and it just grew and grew and grew. And as it grew, I started thinking about who my audience was, less sort of along identity lines, like because there are trans women who are like, this is not my experience. I do not relate to that. And they've said that, to me. And I started thinking, instead of thinking the audience in terms of identity, I began thinking of it in terms of affinity. And when I thought of it in terms of affinity, that like actually there's cis women who I think can relate to a lot that's in this book in terms of motherhood, in terms of even things like dissociation during sex, in terms of um, the dedication to divorce women, but in terms of starting your life over, there was a lot in there that I began to think of my audience as like, yes, I orient myself towards trans women in the same way that I think many other authors orient themselves towards the group that they come from. But I also want to speak to people who have affinity with me. And that's, I think, how I've actually found audiences that for whom the book resonates is through affinity rather than just identity.
Absolutely. How does this story come about? Because as I was reading it, I just thought I've never read anything like this in terms of creating a family of choice. And we talk a lot in the queer community about families of choice, and it's like our thing, especially, for I'm Gen X. For people in my generation, a lot of our parents were very terrible. And, we were thrown out, not me, but like in general, we were like sort of thrown out of our families and had to make families of our own, and certainly previous generations as well. And so we talked about it a lot and we embodied it, I think, but this takes it even a step further. And so I'd love to know the origin story of this novel.
Well, there's a couple of things that happened and it kind of different pieces that all came together. There's the question of the baby, there's the question of the detransition, there's Reese's whole deal. And each of those sort of evolve separately. But on the idea of family, one of the things I was really curious about is as I started writing it, I was writing each of my novellas, I was doing in like a little bit of a different genre. So I did a horror one, I did a post-apocalyptic one, and this was supposed to be a soap opera. So I was like, well, in the soap opera, the kind of classic American way of doing a soap opera in literature is these domestic, these domestic novels. But the domestic novel is so oriented around nuclear families and marriages and these things that actually aren't available in many cases to trans women. And so I was like, what happens when you stick a trans woman into a nuclear family, into the sort of genre of the domestic novel? And in that case, it often like our experiences don't align with that. So I had to sort of break the family and begin to think about what does a nuclear family look like? What do families look like if I put trans women at the center of this rather than you than the sort of nuclear family that you've seen for 50 years. And when I started doing that, I kind of had to invent these situations. And when I had these two characters, it took me a while to find each of them. But when I found and Reese and Amy, that was half of it. And then I found Katrina as the third character, and it was like, oh, it's triangulating in the way I need it to work.
Oh, it really does come together well. When I was reading the book, one of the most striking passages, and I've been obsessed with this passage ever since I read it, and I will never forget it, is the opening pages of chapter 2, where Reese talks about the first time a man hit her and talks about, the way that brought out her femininity. And I think a lot of women could read that and relate in different ways for different reasons. And it's also kind of sexy, even though it's really fucked up. And
Yeah.
for one, kudos. But, you know, as you were thinking through a lot of Reese's character, um, how did you decide to how did you decide to lean into some of her like whole deal, as you put it? Because she says the kinds of things that people are not really gonna ever admit, but she says them, she thinks them, and I really appreciated that. And it made me uncomfortable, and I think that's great. And so I just would love to know more about the genesis of Reese as a character and her thinking of, especially around her relationships with men who that were often abusive in one way or another.
I mean, I grew up, reading things like Sylvia Plath, like every woman adores a fascist. And and that stuff, I think, people still read Sylvia Plath now because it kind of rings true, that there's an affirmation in the ways that men can sometimes treat women badly, and it affirms these gender roles. I don't think Sylvia Plath called it gender roles, but for me, in the way that I see the world, it feels like an affirmation of gender roles. But there's a problem as a trans woman, which is that when if you don't give me credit as a woman, when I say that violence can affirm womanhood, then it sounds like what I'm saying is quite misogynistic, or at least internalized misogyny, that I'm advocating this. And so there's a kind of double bind for trans women where we're behaving in the same way towards men as cis women, but the way that society sort of sees that is like we're sort of these Trojan horses that are bringing in a terrible misogyny. And so what I what I wanted to do is I wanted to actually talk about that. I wanted to talk about the things that are difficult to say for cis women are also difficult to say for trans women. But the only way to say it is to like come right out and say it. I couldn't make those points if I danced around it.
Mm.
And it was very scary for me to write that. I mean, it was very scary first for me to admit it that I've had those situations with men. And
Mhm.
then it was very scary to write it as a trans woman. I mean, I remember I got asked about it on the BBC, and they were like, "So you think violence makes a woman or something like that? You've got 40 seconds to answer live on the radio." And I was like, "Whoa, it is scary to talk about this stuff." And then I think also, um, the great thing about fiction is that you can have, instead of me having to say it, I can have characters who are flawed say it, and I can have I can have them begin to change their mind over the arc of the story. I think at the beginning, the kind of affirmation that Reese needed from the cowboy, she needed it much more than at the end, when it felt like those same sort of affirmations of her gender could maybe be found in unconventional families instead of really traditional gender roles.
Yeah, I can imagine that it was scary because audiences tend to expect, even when writing takes risks, they expect it to be sort of sedate, and this is not sedate. Do you get scared when you write these kinds of things in terms of like sending it into the world? Or are you just brave and you're like, yes, this is it, I'm doing it?
I go through phases, I think the I felt kind of righteous when I wrote that, like had
Mhm.
like worked myself up into sort of righteous, like I get to say this kind of feeling as I wrote that second chapter. Whereas I was very scared of a lot of the stuff I wrote in the Glamour Boutique chapter when Amy is having her first sexual experience and is in the cross-dressing store and then having her first sort of sexual experiences. That one, like the second chapter was scary to me for political reasons. The fourth chapter was scary to me for reasons of shame. That it felt like that I was writing about the stuff that I had experienced as shame and that I think other people had experienced as shame. And so like the reasons why I'm scared change all the time. For me, writing about shame was really important. And I also know that like I feel like when I've written about shame in the past, it's really resonated, in those cases with trans women who have sort of seen like these are things that are so shameful that we can't speak them, and then to read them in a book. I mean, sometimes they sort of freak out and are like, "I can't believe you shared this with like all the cis people or something." But other
Mhm.
times they're like, "Oh, if it's in a book, it can't be that bad." Right? Like if Random House is publishing it and this is what feels like the thing I can't speak aloud, it must not actually be so shameful that it has to be unspoken. And then when you speak it and name it, it sort of defangs it. So there's a way in which like thinking about that and thinking about like I'm writing this, it's scary, but the speaking of it is a kind of defanging. Um, that is what gave me sort of the bravery to do it. I felt like I was like, maybe this is helping me at least. Maybe it's helping other people too.
Absolutely. We have a question from Kiara, who wrote this question to me last week. And actually, it's a good question. I mean, all the questions were good this time. Um, and she wanted to ask about your decision to make Katrina half Chinese, half Jewish. She's curious as to the significance of including a character who's mixed race, because she thinks that at points Katrina serves as this way of calling out Ames's and Reese's whiteness. And she reminds Reese of the struggle of women of color and what types of motherhood they're allowed to or expected to occupy. And on a couple of occasions, Katrina vocalizing her thoughts leads Reese to concede that her statements about women really apply specifically to cis white women or trans white women. So, what function does Katrina's mixed race identity serve, and why is it emphasized from both Ames and Reese's perspectives that Katrina passes as white?
Um, it 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 was a very conscious choice,
Mhm.
her that, and it was for a couple of different reasons. The first is that what I think Reese has and what I have, uh, in the way that I move through the world is that I'm I- I'm almost centered, right? Like basically, I almost pass as a cis white woman. I almost get all of those privileges, and um, and that's sort of my relationships as a marginal identity group towards the center, sort of like this. And so basically, what I wanted to create in Katrina is somebody else who's in a somewhat similar position. There's a sort of aspirational cis white womanhood that both Reese and Katrina are almost there, but not quite, and that could create a sort of resonance between them. If Katrina had been a cis white woman who had everything that Reese Reese wanted, it would have been a different thing where Reese is aspiring to be Katrina, as
Mhm.
opposed to having this sort of relationship where she has to figure it out, and where they're in conflict and they're negotiating these things. The other thing is that I feel that my experience is the experience of a trans white woman, and and Reese's is too. And one of the things that was important to me was to note the sort of the whiteness of my experience and the whiteness of many trans women's experiences, so that when I talk about, both of the characters, they talk like I talk. We say trans women do this, trans women do that, et cetera, because that's just how I talk and how my milieu talks. But I needed a way to basically say, like, this isn't all trans women. This isn't the experience of all trans women. This is a sort of slice of the experience of white trans women. And Katrina was a way to not to just utilize her, but it was a way to sort of begin to talk about the whiteness that could otherwise seem like I was claiming a universal experience here, that I don't want to claim a universal experience. I think, and I think that's not just important for politics. I think it's important for good art. That there's a lot of times when I make fun of people in this book, and I make fun, but largely the targets are people like me. And if it's all trans women, those jokes don't land, right? If I'm making fun of what the things that Reese's wants, and it applies to like a black trans woman or a Latina immigrant trans woman, suddenly it's not funny. But
Mhm.
if I'm like, here's my target, here's exactly the like Brooklyn trans woman that I'm aiming for, then it can land and I can make those jokes. And that I see this book hopefully not existing as like a sort of, this is a trans novel for all trans women, but I hope soon that it's a trans novel and a cacophony of trans voices, where there's black trans women writing, there's Asian trans women writing. And a lot of the way that I wanted to talk about Katrina also was to point to, like, we don't get a ton about Katrina's race, because I don't actually think I'm the person to talk about Katrina's race. I'm pointing to, like, there's books that are going to come soon, and there's books that are already out there. Two on my press. You can, Minor Feelings and Bestiary both just came out there. That if you want to know about that experience, you can go there. But that I want this book to exist as what it is, in what I hope is a future cacophony.
Absolutely, that's a great answer. One of the things I did appreciate was the way that the humor was very specific, because we talk a lot in writing and thinking about humor about punching up instead of punching down, but you do some sort of like horizontal punching.
Yeah.
I also think is really healthy, and just the way you aimed the jokes where they belonged and sort of brought out that Brooklyn basic aesthetic.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people could really find the humor in that and appreciate the humor in that, without feeling called out in an unhealthy way. So I appreciated that in particular. Um, I was interested in the structure of this because it goes back and forth from past to present and different points in the past, so that we start to understand who these people are, who Reese is, who Ames and Amy are, who Katrina is, and how they come to this place where they're even open to having this family that is interesting and unexpected. So, how did you come up with the structure of this novel? And was it always this structure, or did you end here after trying some other things?
I've always sort of enjoyed chopped up timelines. I think it's like just also maybe my age, that I grew up, where like the a lot of the cool art was like, you know, Tarantino or Memento, or like these movies, or like, even now my favorite television shows are things like Westworld, where it's like, playing with time. And what I was curious about doing is like, why is that stuff always for gangsters or for like sci-fi? Like, I wanted to take those same sort of timelines and the sort of advantages that that timeline, that the chopped up timeline gives you, and apply it to something that's like more domestic, more like in a family. And so it I also, I think it also has to do with the way that I think, which is that I will behave a certain way, and I don't always know why I behave a certain way, and then I have to sort of stop and be like, why am I doing this? Why am I reacting this way? And then go back in time to be like, oh, this is how come I am how I am. Like it's almost like a constant sort of therapy for myself, where it's like you go and be like, oh, why do I do this, and like, why do I always mess things up this way? And it's like, oh, I can see that it came from this place, in my childhood or in my teenage years or in some sort of repression. And I wanted a structure that could do that, where you see Reese behave messy and you're like, why would you do that? And then, sort of the same way you would do in like a therapist's office, you can go back in time and be like, oh, of course she would act this way. Like, it's not actually that she's like incredibly messy, it's that she has some sort of trauma, or she has some sort of, past. And I think that these kind of chopped up dual timelines, um, can actually create a lot of empathy that way, where Ames, and the things that seem ridiculous at first, right? That this, why would Katrina consider this? Why would Ames think that this was an okay thing to ask? You know, you can start with these propositions. You're like, this is so wild. And by the end, hopefully you're rooting for the proposition because you know where the characters are coming from. And I think that that's something that could only happen with, I mean, maybe I would be curious to see how someone could do it in a chronological way, but to me, that process happens only when you break chronology.
Yeah, I thought the broken chronology, it made it in many ways kind of like a mystery, sort of how do you come to
Mhm.
this place? Because when Ames first asks Katrina about this, I was just like, wow, wait a minute, has he completely lost his mind? It blew my mind. I was like, this
Yeah,
motherfucker is wild. And, and
he
I
really
thought
is
that was
though.
great because characters tend to make expected choices. And so what I particularly am drawn to is when a character does something where I just think, wait, who, what? And
Yeah.
then I just wanted to find out, like, where would he get the audacity, to
Mhm.
to do something like this? And the broken chronology really did help because by the end, when they're all sitting in that waiting room together, I'm actually rooting for them. I very much want them to be this family. I think that baby would be well served by three such interesting parents. Um, and so I appreciated the structure very much. Uh, let's see. Oh, well, I'm not going to share the name because he didn't give me permission, but could you please tell Tori that hers is the best description of trans dissociation during sex I've ever read. I feel so seen. And so just know that your work resonated with
Oh, thank you.
a reader. And then Rachel has a question, and this was one of my questions as well. Could you please speak more to Katrina's burgeoning identity as living with some queerness herself? And how is your definition of queer including Katrina rather than her being an ally?
Well, actually, this is interesting because that actually speaks to the dissociation question, which is like, when I wrote that chapter, I thought of that dissociation as being a really trans experience, like what it feels like to not be good in your, not feel right in your body, and be expected to sort of like do this act that is so about being in your body.
Mhm.
And I was like, well, this is so trans, like this sort of thing. And then as I wrote that section, and I don't know if you all remember, but then this New Yorker story came out called Cat Person. Do
Yeah.
you remember this?
Oh,
It was
sorry.
like such a big story. No, it's fine.
It's fine.
Like, what was interesting to me about it though is that when I read it, I was like, oh, this is a story about dissociation during sex, and it's the most popular New Yorker story ever. So maybe this thing that I thought was such a trans experience is actually more universal than I thought. Maybe these things that seem so trans or seem so queer are more available to other people. And Katrina, in some ways, is is my character with whom I can sort of see that beginning to happen. You know, when she left her husband, she it wasn't so much like it was anything really terrible. It was just like this dynamic, this like heterosexual dynamic isn't working for me. And
Mhm.
I see, even now, maybe the title of it is problematic, but essays like with the titles like heteropessimism or things like that, where people are like, we this way that we've been doing marriage, these institutions, they aren't working. And so when I see Katrina, in some ways I think she's looking for queerness, but in other ways I think what she's recognized is what many women are recognizing now, which is that the way that these institutions are happening isn't working for everybody. And the people who are trying to solve this, by and large, are queers. So there was a kind of resonance that she saw, that she was like, these people are trying to solve it. No one else is trying to solve it. I'm not sure if I'm queer. I'm not sure who I'm attracted to, but they're doing something. They're going for it, and this is as close to solving the thing that isn't working for me as I've yet come. I actually, in the same way that I sort of withhold my judgment about what Ames's real gender is, I similarly want to like withhold whether or not I think um, Katrina is queer. I think there's a sudden, not sudden, but I think there is an appeal to queerness now that straight people are seeing, like, oh, you don't have to do things certain ways. Maybe I am queer, and also then a not always, which happened with Katrina, not always so much of a familiarity of like the history of queerness, so that you can want the good things, like you can make a family, be whatever you want, without the bad things, which is like a history of discrimination or marginalization. So, um, but basically to conclude, um, the reason I ended with them in that room without an ending is partly because I didn't want to prescribe what Katrina is, what Ames is. I wanted to sort of like pose that the book poses a question of, can Katrina sort of live a queer life without fully being queer? Can Ames do this? How these characters who are stuck in these patterns, can they get out of it? And what kind of structures do we all need to invent to get us out of it? So that ending where it ends, that's the question. Everything that comes after that is the answer that I think it's not just up to me to answer, it's up to all of the readers. Basically be like, how do we want to do families? How do we want to like take what we can from queerness? How do we want to see gender in a new way? And I don't know the answer for that. I think that's like the generational question for this, for queers now.
It is. And as I was reading, and the lack of judgment from you in terms of whether or not Katrina was queer, but the generosity of allowing that maybe she is, in fact, queer, um, really worked, because I think, especially now, after we've seen what COVID and the pandemic have done, particularly to women in terms
Yeah.
of heterosexual relationships. I mean, what a disaster. And so, like, it's clear that we need something else, because the institutions we have bought into for so long don't serve everyone, and they never have, but now we have even more evidence that they don't serve everyone. And so I really thought it was a generous thing to do as a writer, to leave it open, because when I first read Katrina saying maybe I'm queer, I was like, oh girl, no, you're not. Like, just don't
Yeah.
do this. But then as the novel goes on, and I can see her just trying to figure out, like, how do I live? What do I do about this child? What do I do about my relationship? Um, it just started to feel more like maybe she is queer, and like, why am I trying to gatekeep queerness? And
Mhm.
um, I thought that was great that you didn't try to gatekeep either queerness or gender, until allow the ambiguity of who Ames is also to come out. Um, this is a question from Miranda, who says, hi, Tori. The juvenile elephants metaphor landed really hard for me, not just for what it says about trans history, but because of how it describes how vulnerable trans people are to each other's pain and rage. As a woman who has been transitioning for a couple of years, but is in her 30s and who was only really out after the pandemic started, it's been a struggle to find community that's local, and online spaces are, yikes, not great sometimes. When I have, it's been a mix of feeling either incredible to connect with other trans women, or hurt and bitter when it feels like we don't mesh because of age or differing kinds of queerness, or like they're embarrassed with where I'm at in my transition. If the way Ames describes things is fair, is there something you wish you could tell trans people who are struggling to try to be there for other trans folks? and who want to let each other be messy while also protecting their own feelings or sense of belonging. Thank you for such an incredible book.
Yeah, that juvenile elephants thing, that was something that I wrote very, very early on when I was in a place where I was more angry with other trans women. And I think that actually um, that metaphor came out of a place of anger where I was like, why can't we all just like, you know, unite in some ways? Why are there all these divisions between us? And why are we always lashing out, especially as was just noted, online, which in many places is the place that trans women can gather. I'm lucky. I live in Brooklyn. You can't walk down the street without seeing a trans woman. But like, if you're in rural, you know, I don't know, rural Oklahoma or something, it's hard to. The only place you can find community is online, and the things escalate. I mean, everybody here knows how online works, but I think it works even in some ways worse when you've got communities that are traumatized or isolated. So I wrote that metaphor and it felt really true to me when I wrote it. And then the book took 4 years to write. And by the time I finished it, I was like, is this really true? I showed it to um, my friend Cecilia Gentili, who's an activist. She's a Latina activist here in Brooklyn. And she was like, that's not true she's like, it's sort of true, but it's not that true for us. Like, I am like a mother to all sorts of Latina immigrant girls who come here all the time. They don't know what they're doing. They need a place to live. And we actually do have families. It's actually kind of like you white girls who don't know how to take care of each other.
Mm.
And I think that actually goes back historically, where what happened is that Latina women and Black women didn't have the resources to essentially be closeted, right? If you're like a sort of white trans woman in the 80s or 90s, and you want to buy 2 wardrobes and you want to go to other cities to dress up, or you want to do all these different things, you can afford to essentially stay in the closet, and you can afford to not have these like the sort of political organizing that comes from that. Whereas these like girls in the ballroom scene who came out as teenagers and were thrown out from their families, they had to create family structures, and so you can watch something like Paris is Burning, and you can see that they're family structures, and you can see that there are sort of elders to be like, knock it off, when someone's misbehaving. um, Whereas for a lot of us white girls, we didn't have that, and we didn't accept it when people told us to knock it off. It was like, who are you to tell me to knock it off? And so I think that there's, when Cecilia pointed this out to me, it was like, oh, again, this experience that I have that felt so universal is actually really specific to sort of my world. And that's again when sort of when Katrina sort of offers some opinions about that. And so what I would say again to the person who questions this is to look that there are trans women who have figured out this problem. They aren't white trans women.
Mhm.
And so start seeing. I model a lot of the ways that I do community now from trans women of color who I think have known the importance of uniting and conflict resolution, and what it's like to do that with scarcity of resources, um, in a way that I didn't have to know until later in my life. Um, and so that would be my answer is that actually there are models, and I hope that the questions that Katrina asks begins to point to those models.
Mhm. Throughout the book, we see glimpses of motherhood, and you describe the relationship Katrina has with her mother, the meaning of motherhood for Reese as she mentored younger generations and thought about the type of mother she would be. Katrina becoming a mother only with a committed partner, nursing mothers, and that kind of thing. And so this is from Adriana. She really appreciated the various types of mothers you described, but what about fathers, especially given Ames's reservation about becoming one?
I hadn't thought about fathers, and I think it's probably also because fathers made me uncomfortable to think about. So it was easier to talk about mothers. But I actually think that that I've talked to some gay men who read this book, and it resonated with them that actually father is a gender role that makes them uncomfortable. The stoic dad, or the a sort of toxic masculinity in fatherhood. And um, I think what's interesting to me about sort of trans thought right now is the way that it's beginning to sort of, I think, bleed out into the mainstream. So that in the same way that, for instance, like I think of my own race in terms that were first thought up by Black scholars, Black thinkers, or thinkers of color. That's how I learned how to talk about my own race. Or I feel like straight people know how to talk about their sexuality through terms that were defined by queer thinkers.
Mhm.
There's a thing that's happening where gender roles now we begin to understand our gender roles through kind of trans thought. And you can see this like even just in like popular culture, where you see like those memes on Twitter that are like the two genders, and it's like, I don't know, a trash can and a lamp or whatever it is. Like but that way of thinking of gender, that gender is actually a kind of role, and there's many types of genders and many types of roles, like a lumberjack or the sea shanty sailors or whatever. That what's really what I think would be useful to fathers in this is to begin to think of fathers not as necessarily a biological role that's so fixed, because that but to begin to think of fathers as a series of genders performances, and that there are many types of fathers, and that when people are uncomfortable with fatherhood, maybe you're uncomfortable because, like, okay, you biologically produced a child, but maybe you're uncomfortable with the roles that are sort of the baggage of fatherhood, and that fathers can begin to do the kind of gendered work that I think women have been doing and that trans people have been doing, and basically be like, do I want this role? Do I want to have to like be stern with my son, or tell him that he has to catch a football, or whatever it is that uh, you know a stern dad demands? I don't really know, but uh, you saw me like sort of flailing there. A dad
Yeah, I was
thing,
like, not your
a
territory.
football. Like, um, so, uh, so the, but I think that that's how the book would apply to fatherhood. Obviously, there's the majority of the thought that I put into it has to do with motherhood, just because that's what resonated so much for me.
Mhm. This is sort of tangential, and this is from Asa. I hope I pronounced your name right, Asa. There is no explicit discussion of trans bio baby making methods in this book. For example, trans femmes storing gametes pre-estrogen or coming off later to try and get a good sample, trans masks coming off tea to try to get pregnant, even though this is a reality for many trans people and a big part of queer family making. What was behind this decision? I thoroughly enjoyed this book and was captivated by it.
Um, there's a couple of things. One is that I think when many people transition, um, it's at a point in their life where they don't have a lot of resources. So for me, for instance, when it was like, do you want to bank sperm? Well, I don't remember how much it was. It was something like $60 a month, or, plus original, like $1,000 to start out. It was money I didn't have, to $1,000 to start it, and then $60 a month just to keep it in storage. And I was in such a place of like dissociation and difficulty with my body, that the idea of doing that was sort of horrifying to me. And it wasn't until after I transitioned and got right with myself that I was sort of like, well, I wish I could have done that. But in the meantime, that could have been thousands of dollars that, just to pay for it. And and I think the solution, for a lot of my this is generally just how I feel. Um, the solution for trans people isn't more medicalization. That's my particular opinion. That like, oh, we need these special procedures for trans people to like biologically raise children. I think that there's a lot of children in the world, and it would be a lot easier for people to begin to have family formations that don't require thousands of dollars of intervention for trans people to have families. We can have families now with the bodies that we have. There are many children out there who need parents, who need care, and and there are a lot of trans people who are willing to give care.
Mhm.
The problem isn't, do we have the right technology? In my opinion, the problem is that there's a lot of prejudices separating those people who want to care for children from the children.
Oh, absolutely. And we see it, we saw it starting again under the Trump administration,
Yeah.
that queer people, trans people, like it in some states, like, and I'm in California, if my wife and I
Mhm.
decide to adopt, which, we're circling around in a roundabout sort of way, it's going to be fine. But if you're in Florida or Oklahoma or another state, it's not so easy. And it's interesting that we often think of the barrier as biology and spending all of this money because it is cost prohibitive,
Yeah.
when in fact a lot of it is societal because there are
Mhm.
quite a lot of children waiting for homes. It's a lot to think about. This is a question from David, who says, to the best of my understanding, there isn't a trans masculine or identified non binary or genderqueer character in the novel, either as a member of the background queer community that is sometimes present at parties and so on, nor among its named main and supporting characters. I'm not suggesting that a novel about trans women, cis women, motherhood, parenting, and fatherhood in the case of Ames must necessarily include a visibly identifiable trans masculine perspective or a non binary one. But given the themes situated around fatherhood and parenting in particular, not including an explicitly trans masculine perspective or non binary or genderqueer one seems to be a choice. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind explaining that choice a little bit. Were there characters of these kinds that you had to eliminate from previous drafts? Or were you seeking to disrupt the very idea of discrete categorization, even as it applies to the gay queer community, and the presumed flexibility and elasticity of those labels?
There's two characters in the book. The trans guy Ricky, who fixes his motorcycle, who has a long conversation, and
Hmm.
who appears again on the beach. And so, and then there's also Babs, the non-binary beauty who rides the manatees in Florida. That so I think that there is the existence of trans guys and non-binary people in the book. The questioner is right though, in that they're not major parts of the plot. They don't drive the plot. And I think that has to do with just sort of the themes that I'm working with, which is I'm interested in um, pursuing womanhood. And if you're non-binary or you're transmasculine, you are explicitly identifying yourself as not a woman. So that makes sense to me. I would also say that my background is in a scene of trans writing. And so um, I write with a number of trans guys all around me. I'm reading stories of trans guys. And so it may not feel that way if like you're looking at the bookstore and what you see on the table is only Detransition Baby. But for me, I'm surrounded by trans guys' stories. And I feel like if you want a trans guy's story, you can go to Davy Davis, you can go to Jordy Rosenberg, you can go to any number of extremely talented people who are writing transmasculine stories, and and in fact, you don't want me telling that story. Those people are excellent storytellers, and I highly recommend looking for their work.
Do you ever feel a pressure to be everything to everyone? Because one of the things I notice is that there's always a question, and this has nothing to do with the questions asked this evening, but there's always a question of why didn't you include X, Y, and Z in your book about
Mhm.
A, B, and C? Do you feel pressured with that, or do you just ignore it because you know what your mission is?
I think, I mean, it depends sort of what's being asked of me. The with, for instance, like the transmasculine perspective, because I know so well those writers, I don't feel much about it. I had a and because I feel a lot of like familiarity with that world. Some people ask me why wasn't there more about Katrina's background, as an Asian woman. And that's not something that I really feel a lot of ownership over, but yet I created this character. So like, should I have made that more full? And I mean, I think I said a little bit earlier in the answer, my idea or the way that I think about it to feel okay with that is to think of myself on a stage with many of those other people, even if they're not there with me. And that my job when I talk about the book is to point to those writers, as I've been trying to do tonight when I mentioned, Bestiary or Minor Feelings, or when I mentioned Jordy Rosenberg and David Davis, that I don't want to tell those stories. Nobody wants me to tell that story for Asian women.
Mhm.
Trans guys don't want me to tell their story. My work is more outside of the text to basically acknowledge, yes, here's what my text is doing. It is not a universal text. Here's where you can find those other answers.
Jess asks, one stylistic choice that jumped out at me as a trans woman was the use of transsexual rather than the more common term transgender. What does the choice of that word mean to you?
It's just like the word that my friends and I use. I think it's like a slightly funnier, more glamorous word. Like it's a funnier word than like transgender. The history of transgenders that comes from the medical establishment, as I wrote about in the book, it was created for a sort of to name a vector of disease during the HIV and AIDS crisis. So, and it's like very, it's a politically correct word. It's a non-specific word. It works as an umbrella for any number of different types of trans people. Whereas transsexual is very specific, but more than that, I like the connotations. I think transsexual is like a super pulpy word. It's like a sort of like exploitation movie word. And that to me, rather than being afraid of that, I like it. I think it's more fun. I quote my friend Morgan Page, when she calls herself a transsexual, she says, "I earned every one of those syllables." So that's kind of how I feel that it's our word, and why not use it? It's a fun word.
Absolutely. Has the success of this book exceeded your expectations? If so, what kind of doors do you think this might open for you?
It has definitely exceeded my expectations. I mean, like I said, when I started it, I thought I was going to self-publish it, and then I thought I was maybe on a small press, and then I thought it was going to be sort of like down list at Random House, and it kept on sort of reaching these hurdles, and then getting over them, and every time I was a little bit surprised. Um, I don't know what kind of doors it'll open for me because uh, all I ever wanted was this, right? All I wanted was like the time and space to write novels,
Mhm.
and now I have it. And there are things that feel good, like the accolades or the kind of respect that comes from that, where there's a kind of validation. But I'm hoping. I mean, it's funny to say. I'm hoping that I'm able to work in the exact same way that I wrote this. When I wrote this, I was struggling a little, but I put together a way of living where I could make money for a couple days, and then I'd have a couple days to myself, and I could write. And um, and that's what the whole time I was like, I can't wait to have enough success where I don't have to do this. And now that I have a bit of success, I was like, that was the best work I'd ever done. That was when I was happiest, when I was like in a flow. And so there's a way in which like I kind of just want to return to that state.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that's the dream for a lot of us is to get into
Yeah.
that flow and then stay there because once you lose it, it's so hard to
Yeah,
find
it's
it again.
so hard.
How does it feel for non-trans folks to have opinions about the book? When is this voyeurism and when is it learning about experiences that aren't one's own?
If you'd asked me that um 3 or 4 years ago, I would have been much more protective of trans identities and been like, only we get to speak on this. And you know, I've come around. One of the reasons that I dedicated this book to divorced women is that I learned so much from cis women, especially divorced women. I wrote this at a time when I was a little bit struggling to figure out how to live, and I read all these novels by divorced women that had a perspective that I recognized. And slowly I began to recognize, like, oh, these women have a trajectory like mine. They lived their life a certain way, believing a certain thing about themselves. And then there was a break or a kind of failure. And they had to move forward without um, reinvesting in the same illusions that led to that failure or getting bitter. And that really is the challenge of trans women. I transitioned when I was 30 and I lost a lot when I transitioned. I had 10 years in which I built relationships with people, and many of those relationships went away, including, my own partner and certain relationships with my family and friends, and definitely my ability to make money the way I used to make money. That was all gone. So I had to not turn bitter, and the people who taught me not how to not turn bitter were divorced women who were also starting all over.
Mm.
And so if I look at the experience of that taught me, and I'm like, uh, I want to speak to you, I want to hear what you have to say because it's been so important to me. Then I also want to begin to offer something back, and that was really the goal. Is that I want this to be a conversation. I I've learned so much from cis women, and now I think I have something that maybe like ways of seeing gender, ways of thinking about family that could be useful to cis women, which means that like I'm really open to being talked to. I'm really open to opinions. And the thing and really I don't care if anybody knows the right words, if they know the right terms for this. Like I don't want somebody to have to read an etiquette book to come up and talk to me. You can tell when somebody's being respectful, you
Mhm.
know? It doesn't, maybe you don't know the right words, you don't think, but you come to, if someone comes to you with respect, you can tell. And so if people come to me with respect and they don't know things, um, I'm pretty open to talking. If it's like really obvious where it's like this is something you just want to know a fact you could Google, I might be like, go on and Google that. But like if it's a if it's a real question about like what does it mean to live in a certain way, like let's have a conversation, I'm totally open to that, and I don't want to shut anybody down or feel that I'm unapproachable or that that somebody doesn't have a right to speak about their own experiences to me.
Um, okay, I'm going through the questions.
Yeah.
They're all good, but some of them have actually already been answered through other questions. So this is not, I'm going to get to it, but are you reading anything good right now, or what are some great books that you've read in the past while, if you've been able to read?
I have been able to read. Let's see. My friend Jackie has a book called Daryl coming out that I'm really excited about. She's a Black trans woman, and she wrote about a she wrote about a white cuckold fetishist, which sounds like which sounds like really ridiculous, but is actually like a very heartfelt book that takes a lot of trans knowledge and gives it to somebody who, or like it, her perspective as a trans woman, she offers it to somebody who normally wouldn't be the person who would benefit from that knowledge. And I really, really enjoyed it. That's coming out in I think the next couple months.
Oh,
Um, yeah, and I read Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar, and that really moved me. Um, Basically because I think he was talking. People don't often think like, oh, like a Muslim American man and Tory, let's put them in conversation. But in fact, a lot of ways that he talked about identity and then he talked about the stratification of identity along class is like sort of, I think, a third rail in queer politics where nobody wants to talk about who has money and who doesn't have money and the ways that that changes things. And for me, the way he spoke in that book was really a blueprint for thinking about a lot of the fights that a lot of the fights and provocations that are happening in both queer and trans communities. And it's just an excellent, excellent book. It's written. He won the Pulitzer for a play in 2013,
yeah, he did.
and he can write.
He can. When I saw that I read the play and I thought it was wonderful. And when I saw that he had written a novel, I was like, of course. Of
Yeah.
but in the best possible way. I'm actually at the very beginning of that, so I'm glad to hear that it's going to stay good because so far it is. Uh, Rebecca asks, not a lot of works of fiction, point to other works of fiction, or even facts. We have Ames talking about young elephants and the analogy of Hemingway's white elephants. Why did you decide to have these touchstones in the novel?
Well, my background is actually in nonfiction. I started thinking I wanted to write sort of creative nonfiction, and even now, I sort of oscillated my reading habits between sort of classical fiction and a lot of like the newer stuff like auto fiction or kind of prose stuff. One of my favorite books is "Time is the Thing That a Body Moves Through" by T. Clutch Fleischman, and it really just brings in a whole lot of information, um, and and makes stories out of it. And I think that I think a lot of my favorite books, even that are just like such good works of fiction, actually do stop every once in a while and tell you things. Like the Ferrante series, the Neapolitan novels, are some of my favorite books. And Ferrante is always stopping. She's so ferocious that you don't notice, but she'll stop and she'll give you an essay on like Italian feminism in the middle of like you know a torrid marriage breakup or something like that. And I like that. I think that actually characters, most of the characters and people I know are eager to discuss ideas. And so it's not real, the fiction doesn't have a kind of reality to it if people aren't willing to stop to have their characters slow down and think over ideas sometimes. Is basically my thought about it.
I have a question I'd love to ask every writer I have the privilege of speaking with as we bring this to an end, only because we've run out of time. And that is, what do you like most about your writing?
I mean, you know, it's hard because this is like really an opportunity for me to indulge my ego. But I like the dynamism. I like that I throw in everything. I feel like I can go from heartbreaking to funny in a single page, and I like being able to shift gears really fast, and shift modes that um, you know, I always admired like the Russian novelists because they throw every emotion into a book, you know, and I've always wanted to do the same thing. I've never done sort of long studies in mood or tone. I'm constantly shifting moods, and for a lot of people, I think that can be jarring or can be like this is chaotic. But for me, that is actually something I enjoy, and when I'm writing and I suddenly change moods, I'm usually like sitting here in front of my computer grinning. So, and I hope that comes through in the book.
It does. And are you working on a new novel or other?
I am. Yeah, I have a what I'm calling, and these words don't usually go together, but what I'm calling a queer financial thriller, which is, yeah, I know it's like but I will say it involves Wall Street, blackmail, sex work, and and the Chicago Underground. Part of it takes place underground. So we'll see. In my head, it makes total sense. Whether or not it makes sense as it gets on the page, we'll see. Um, but so far, I've been enjoying myself.
Good. I'm really glad to hear that. Torrey Peters, thank you so much both for writing Detransition Baby and spending time with this club tonight. We've really enjoyed this conversation and your thoughtful answers. And this book has given us a lot to think and talk about, and we're going to continue those conversations, I suspect. And I hope that you have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to your whole team for doing this. Thanks for making it accessible also. And this has just it's been wonderful for me. And thank you everyone for the amazing discussion. Your questions, I've been fought like, I didn't want to be like a weird lurker on the boards, but really y'all wrote great questions, great answers. And thank you for putting so much thought into my work. It's been a privilege.
Awesome. We want to also thank Liel, who is our interpreter this evening. And our next book is going to be The Removed by Brandon Hobson. And details about that chat we're figuring out the day and time. It may already be figured out. Will be sharing that information in the coming weeks. So I hope everyone has a good night and enjoys reading our next selection.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, wait.